Recording started, good to go. All right, welcome everyone. My name is Oliver Maruda from the Whisky List, and tonight we are drinking Dramfool, a very cool independent bottlers from Scotland. They're quite new on the Australian, side of things. They've been slowly growing and importing through Michael at the Rare Liquor King. They're available at some of the bars like Whiskey and Element in Melbourne as well. And yeah, I believe this is the very first time we get to do a virtual tasting with the guys live from Scotland. So joining us tonight is Colin Fraser and Bruce, who's just running a few minutes late, but welcome, Colin.
Thank you for having me. Bruce will be probably corralling two kids onto the school bus. So if you hear screaming and whatnot when he comes on, that'll be the one that didn't want to go to school. So good evening all.
So we always joke about with our Scottish guests that whilst we're enjoying a late start at 7:30, they are having their breakfast whiskeys. So
it's I was going to say it's a challenge, but the rest of the day might be the challenge. This will be the fun bit. So yeah.
Okay, cool. And Emma, who normally runs our virtual tastings, she's unfortunately hosting another tasting in person in Melbourne right now, a large charity dinner. So she sends her apologies, and I've been pulled back into the hosting chair tonight. So great to see you all. Welcome, Ross, as well. We'll keep the session pretty informal. If you have any questions, like always, put it into the chat. If you prefer to ask it in person, just raise your hand and I'll unmute you. The lineup tonight, we'll kick off with the Tullibardine, then we'll move to the Glenrothes, the Laddie Dramfool 57, Laddie 11-year-old bourbon cask, the Dramfool 58, Laddie 11-year-old Rivsalts, Barrique. Can never pronounce that one. And then there's been a slight labeling issue, which hopefully is very evident when you pour them in your glass. The one that says 59 Port Charlotte bourbon cask, but is very dark in color, that is actually the Port Charlotte Oloroso cask. And vice versa, the one that says 60 Port Charlotte Oloroso with a very light color. Hopefully you can see the difference. So the last two, you just need to rotate them tonight. The dark one is the one we're having at the end, the Oloroso cask. So I'll remind everyone when we get to that again, and apologies for the label mix up there.
This is to test the palates. If you can taste sherry on the bourbon one, you've got something wrong. So, you know. See, Bruce has wrestled the kids onto the bus, so we're now a full complement. So.
Great. Well, welcome, Bruce. I'll make you co-host as well. Can you hear us, Bruce?
Yeah. Is it good evening?
Yeah, good evening and good morning to you.
Yeah, sorry I'm late. I actually, the schools are on strike today, so the kids weren't going to school. But I had a meeting online with the boss of my other job, because this is just a part-time job for myself and Colin just now. But hopefully we can give up the day jobs and do this full-time soon. So for those of you that don't know me, my name's Bruce. I was the founder of Dramfool. I've been working with Colin for the last couple of years. And Colin's the brains behind the outfit. I'm just the idiot that tastes the whiskey and decides if it's good enough for us to bottle.
It's a great role to have.
I totally agree.
All right, well, let's kick off. It's always fun to get whiskey on lips as soon as possible, and then we'll hear a bit from the guys about how they started Dramfool, who they are, what they represent, their bottling, etc. But yeah, let's start off with whiskey number one, the Ukraine Tullibardine 46. Colin or Bruce, who wants to kick off telling us about this whiskey?
Well, I'll start on this one. So the Ukraine bottlings are not our bottlings. These were done by a company from Kyiv called Whiskey UA. When the war started a year ago and a little bit now, to try and make some impact themselves, to try and help what everybody hoped was going to be a short affair, but obviously rumbles on. They decided to do what they knew how to do, and they bottled a couple of casks of whiskey. All the profits, and I think all the profits and probably most of the income from that went to humanitarian charities in Ukraine, some military, some civilian, hospitals, this sort of thing. And they had a great response. They sold out their first two casks very quickly. We were very pleased to be able to offer those for sale for them. And then they bottled another 2 casks, and this is the third cask out of the 4 they've done so far. So they took their interest in whiskey and their passion in whiskey, and they've turned it into charitable and exercise. Therefore, one problem we have with some of their whiskies is their labelling, while all up to Scottish labelling standards, doesn't quite give us all the information we'd like. So it is Tullibardine, we know that, which is a Highland whiskey. It's one that's not perhaps the most known. It is bottled as a single malt. There can be quite a lot of it in the independent bottlers market, but it's not one that in Scotland perhaps has as much following as some other single malts. But the question we always ask is, do you like it? What do you think? Is this a whiskey you would go to?
So the first thing, for those who've sort of been joining our virtual tastings last year, we actually got to try a few different indie bottlings of this distillery, and has a very distinct character that I think is still present and not buried too much by the sherry here. Is it's quite like a fresh meadow, grassy note that kind of sits under the undertone, and for me that is like classic Tullibardine. But then then the wood, the oak really powers through and kind of gives you body and finish.
This interesting. There's no age statement on this one on the label. From memory, it was 9 or 10 years old, we were told, but don't quote me on that. The interesting thing was it was finished in a first fill Chateau Margaux cask, so a red wine cask. So that's where you're getting some fruit from, a kind of sherry type influence as well. And at 46%, obviously it's not cask strength, so it's probably, you've lost some of that power of the Margaux as well. But we used this one on the weekend, I think, didn't we, Bruce? And it was quite well received.
Yeah, we hosted a charity Ukraine tasting, and at Dramfool we don't like giving money away, but all the ticket sales, the full amount. So we sold the kits for £50. We sold 27 kits, so we donated £1,350 to the British Red Cross to help the humanitarian side of things in Ukraine. Some of the labels on these whiskey UA bottles are quite kind of aggressive, I would say. Very, very, very pro-defensive Ukraine. Some of the funds from the bottles may have gone to purchase weapons, etc. So we had to tread a very fine line with that, because although we support the Ukraine cause, we don't like to be seen to be, supporting the aggressive side of it. So that's why we donated our charity tasting proceeds to the Red Cross, who are giving the support to families that need it most on the front line, who are needing medical treatment, people that have been displaced from houses, etc. It was a bit of an honor for us to be able to sell these bottles. They are interesting. They are a bit different. Interestingly, they were all bottled by a company in Scotland called Whisky Broker. I don't know if you've heard of him. He is a big facility in Creetown, which is in Dumfries and Galloway in the southwest of Scotland. So not a traditional distilling location. It's near to the Bladnoch distillery that some of you may have heard of. And he has a huge warehousing complex. He bottles his own whiskey, but he also does a lot of bottling for other people. He trades in casks of whiskey. So I'm assuming the Whiskey UA guys have bought the casks direct from the stock that Martin at Whisky Broker had, and Whisky Broker have bottled it for them. So Whisky Broker have done their bit to support the cause in Ukraine as well. But the Tullibardine it's not a whiskey that connoisseurs in Scotland certainly kind of seek out. It's seen as, I wouldn't say it's run of the mill. There are some really good bottlings out of there, but there are some really kind of bland and insipid's maybe too strong a word, but you know what I mean. There's nothing really too much about them. But we would normally, if we bottle a whiskey, all joking aside, as I said earlier on, I taste a whiskey, and the first thing I do is are there any off notes in it? Is there something I don't like about the whiskey? And if I can't find anything I don't like about the whiskey, the next step is, can I find something positive about the whiskey? Is there something nice about the whiskey? And if I can't find anything nice about it, we don't bottle it. So we don't bottle whiskey that, you know, is just okay. We only bottle whiskey that's good. So I'm being honest, I'm not sure we would have bottled that particular whiskey. It's interesting with the Chateau Margaux finish. I think it could have probably, you know, if I'm being brutally honest, and I'm always trying to be honest because there's a lot of smoke and mirrors in the Scotch whisky industry. I mean, I think that could have done with being a little bit longer in that Chateau Margaux cask. And okay, it might have masked the distillery profile, but I think you might have got a bigger array and depth of flavors. But that's just my personal opinion. Everyone's different.
I like the fact that being in independent bottlers, you get to run your business as honestly as possible. So there's transparency in your cask selection, and you can be honest with the cask. If you don't like it, you don't like it. If you love it, you love it. And you have full control over it. You don't bottle something you will never ever want to put your label on it at the end of the day, right?
That's correct. I mean, ultimately, Dramfool as a company, you're looking at the two guys that run Dramfool. We don't have a team of admin assistants or a team of chairmen that we need to answer to. We are the chairman. It's just us two. So we do everything from the accounting to cask selection to packaging up bottles to boxing up, you know, dozens of bottles to send over to Australia. We do everything. So there's no task below us. Although as we hopefully move full time, there will be some tasks that are below us because we hope to pay someone else to do those jobs. Just now we do everything.
It's fun being in startup mode, but yeah, the growth phase is something to look forward to. Just quick question to around the room. Any tasting notes? What are people thinking about this first whiskey, the Telebardine? Thumbs up, thumbs down in the middle for those with cameras on. Okay. Is it the red wine component that's not sitting right, or just yeah, Michael?
Well, what's really interesting with wine cask finishes or wine cask matured whiskey, until very recently, it was a style of whiskey that I kept at arm's length, because there used to be anyway, a lot of really badly wine finished whiskies or wine matured whiskies. And the reason for that is with a lot of the red wine casks, and this applies to sherry as well, you can get a really strong sulfur note. And it can go from sulfury to burning tires at Brand's starting grid, to chemically burnt hair. You know, if you're in a woman's hairdressers and someone's getting their hair bleached with peroxide, you get that burnt hair smell. And these are flavor profiles that basically, if I take a sip, it gives me whiplash. I would go as far as saying I'm almost allergic to it. So yeah, there were a lot of bad wine finished whiskies coming out, and I think the reason for the sulfur element with a lot of these casks, the important thing is, once the initial product, i.e. the wine or the sherry, has been emptied, you've got quite a limited window to actually refill the cask with whiskey before you get molds, etc., forming on the inside of the wood on the casks. So what they have done, you know, if they can't get these casks from Spain or France or wherever they are up to Scotland quickly enough, they take the head off the cask and they put a sulfur candle in it. And the sulfur candle basically sterilizes the wood. It stops this mold from forming. But unfortunately, those sulfur notes, if the cask isn't handled properly once it arrives in Scotland, they can permeate into the whiskey. So yeah, but that particular whiskey you're tasting there, There's maybe just a whisper of sulfur. I don't know if anyone's picking it up, but it wasn't enough for me to be put off the whiskey.
You're on mute, Oliver.
I am on mute. I kind of agree with what Michael just said here. The finish drops off where the wine flavors come in. So I feel like maybe, longer maturation, like you mentioned, Bruce, or something else, that there is a component. It could evolve.
Finishing in casks is a mystery as well. You know, some casks are hugely active and you get color and flavor really quickly. Others, the cask hasn't absorbed as much of the original content, therefore, or the wood is a particularly tighter grain. You know, therefore the influence is slower. It's a mysterious thing. I mean, it's a wonderfully mysterious thing, but it adds a challenge, which is good.
There's one large independent bottler, and I mean large, one of the biggest independent bottlers that do some of our bottling for us. You know, we get our casks moved to them, and they basically draw samples out of the casks, and if we're happy with them, we ask them to bottle them for us. And the production manager, over the last few years, we've built up a good working relationship, and he let me into an industry secret that I was absolutely astonished by. That he says, depending on where you get your casks from, obviously finishes, as Colin says, can vary a bit, but the supplier of the Spanish sherry casks that they use, they have found that they get all the cask influence once they've re-racked after about 6 months. So all the colour and all the flavour from the sherry and absorbed in the wood comes out after 6 months. So he says any further maturation after that, it's just time, it's just normal maturation. You're not getting any more colour or flavours from the previous occupant of the cask extracted. After that 6 months, it's just purely the action of normal maturation and wood. And that astonished me, because there's a lot of distilleries in Scotland that have a display with various bottles going from clear right the way through, yellow, amber, right the way through to almost Coca-Cola in colour, saying these are samples drawn from the same cask every year, once a year. So you can see the longer you leave it in the sherry cask, the more colour you get. And that's obviously bullshit. So I think that's very interesting. But it was a surprise to me. And this guy, he's worked in the whiskey industry for 30 years. He's a keeper of the quaich. If he doesn't know, no one's going to know. So he told me that the cask they use, he says they only re-rack for normally on average 6 months, maximum 9 months. And then after that, they've got the finish that they require. And the whiskies that they bottle are really dark. They're like that the sherry Port Charlotte that you've got in your pack.
Just before we jump onto the next whiskey, you raised the question, actually, I was thinking about. Did I read correctly recently the Scotch Whisky Association changed the rules around like labeling laws when a whiskey's finished, or when it's double maturation, or the amount of time or anything like that?
Not to our knowledge, no. I mean, the major change. I mean,
some bottlers are following a much more transparent line.
Yeah, but I mean, I mean, the major change recently was you're not allowed to call whiskey pure malt. That was sort of in the last 10 years. So pure malt being a blend of malt whiskies. So now you have to call it a blended malt. Some people still refer to it as a vatted malt. So basically, a blended malt is if you mixed Laphroaig and Lagavulin together. It's two single malts, but it's blended. But there's no grain whiskey in it. But they did tighten up. I think it was about 5 years ago. So if you had an Islay single malt, the wording on the label needs to be single Islay malt Scotch whisky, and it's the same for Speyside, Highland, Campbelltown, lowland, single lowland malt Scotch whisky, and you need to have that description exactly. The other thing that's interesting is the strength and the volume in the bottle, 70 cl and 60% or whatever. That needs to be a minimum of 4 millimeters in height on the label, or you can get in a lot of bother. So we have to be careful if we make any drastic changes to our labels, just to make sure that we're in compliance with that. Although I don't think we're big enough for the Scotch Whisky Association to pick up on us. We're not. We don't have all our bottles in Royal Mile whiskies or in Master of Malt. Not yet, anyway. But
Not yet, not yet.
Yeah.
Great, thank you.
Depends who we piss off on the way. You never know, Bruce. Someone might take umbrage to us.
Yeah.
Let's jump onto whiskey number 2, which is the Ukraine Glenrothes 13-year-old at 50.2% ABV. You want us, apart from the very cool label, which I know again you mentioned, kind of mentioning the war, that there was, if people have been following the war, there was a very famous Top Gun pilot called the Ghost of Kiev, which I believe is on the label of this one. So yeah, again, a bit of a collector's item if you're into your labels and whiskies. But yeah, let's taste it and tell us a little bit about it.
Interesting one to think about with this one is this is from a refill sherry cask. So again, 13 years old. So if you think about what Bruce was saying about colour coming quickly and a lot of the flavour coming very quickly, if you're putting into casks, visually on the photo that you just saw, you wouldn't jump thinking it was necessarily a whiskey sherry cask. Obviously, it's a refill, so I would say the majority of that impact has come out in the first fill of the cask. But when you're tasting it, you do still pick up some of the sherry notes, but by no means dominant, I would say, Bruce. I mean, it's a much more subtle flavor.
Yeah, I maybe should have been a bit clearer about what I said about the casks earlier on. That rule applies to first fill casks. So casks that have just been emptied of sherry or port or wine or whatever. But you do get a lot of refill wine and sherry casks out there, and they can have an impact. Obviously, it depends on how long the first whiskey was in the cask for. If the first whiskey was only in for a couple of months, and then you refill it with another whiskey, you're obviously going to get more colour and flavour from that cask than if the first whiskey had been in for 6 to 9 months. So, yeah, I'm always a bit wary. We get offered a lot of refill sherry casks, and you're thinking, okay, how many times has it been refilled? What was the complete length of time there's been whiskey in this cask since it was emptied of sherry? So, yeah, it's tricky, but yeah, the Glenrothes, certainly you do pick up a little bit of sherry on it, and obviously Glenrothes is quite famous for doing releasing sherry matured whiskey, and over the recent sort of 5 years or so, they're starting to develop quite a good reputation. Obviously, in the past, Macallan was seen as the king of sherry malts. In the eyes of a lot of people, it's still the king, but these are the people that collect the bottles, not drink the whiskey. Macallan as a drinking whiskey has really gone downhill because they've been victims of their own success. They've had to, because Macallan is sought after all over the world. 20 years ago, the poor casks that weren't suitable to put in the Macallan 10, 12, 18 range, they would be sold off for blends. Now Macallan need to use every drop of whiskey they distill. So obviously some of the inferior whiskey from the inferior casks has to go into their standard products. So you may remember they released a range, I think it's about 7 or 8 years ago. It was Macallan Gold, Macallan Amber. They were really, really poor whiskies. The only one that was really good in my view was the Macallan Ruby, but that was much more expensive. That was sort of $500 a bottle or something like that. So where was I going with this? Yeah, sorry, I've kind of meandered. I do that a lot. Basically, Glenrothes, Aberlour, Glenallachie, You know, they are the sort of three big Speyside whiskies that are now got a really good name for sherried whiskey recently. And then just outside the Speyside border, you've got Glendronach as well. And a lot of people think that Glendronach, hands down, is the best sherried whiskey that's currently available. That are releasing bottles just now. They think that's the best one to go for. But yeah, Glenrothes is up there.
Do you guys have a personal favorite sherry house that you like to enjoy?
I'll let Colin answer that. Colin's from the heart of Speyside. He's the expert.
If you look at my mum and dad's front window, Macallan Distillery is just over the river. So we were spoiled as underage drinkers. We were drinking Macallan 18-year-old at 40 quid a bottle, as you could buy it for in those days through the staff shop. But that's an insight into my past. But I think, as Bruce says, Macallan, started at an absolute peak, and that's what everybody tried to replicate. And if you're trying to replicate somebody who is considered to be better than you, to be as good, you have to be better. So people like Billy Walker's names come up in the chat, and that's absolutely right. What he put into Glendronach and now obviously Glenallachie, the cask quality is absolutely superb. The whiskies are superb. I'm a big fan of Tamdhu, and if you go back to the 90s Tamdhus, there's some 10-year-olds from back then you can sometimes pick up an auction really cheaply. They're absolutely, fantastic. And then I was beaten by Matt in the chat that Glenfarclas, these are all classic Speysides that really sit well with sherry. Mortlach, the old Mortlach Flora and Fauna 16-year-old bottling was a standard, everyday purchase. Now, a bit more expensive than it used to be, but again, was another Speyside. As the whole region was interesting. You could the pubs in Speyside, and you're in the shadow of Glenfarclas, Aberlour, Tamdhu, Macallan, Glenrothes. The majority of distillery workers, I would be drinking Mortlach 16 just because it was considered a really good whiskey. But then you change. I mean, Bruce and I were on Isla last year and had a sherried Lafroig. I think it was a Lafroig of a Bocarat, quite an old one. It was phenomenal. So again, the different flavor profiles, sherry and smoke, I think go as well. Find out later, so we'll keep that story for later. But go really well as well. So there's no wrong answer. Whiskey's good for you. So
it's very good. I agree. What do people at home think about the whiskey number 2, this Glenrothes 13-year-old 50%? Good, okay, in the middle. All right, got a
middle. That's not bad.
Not bad. Ross, thumbs up from Ross. Yeah, a few other thumbs up as well. Matt, thumbs up as well. Cool. Just going through the
Dram 3, they'll all be off mute and they'll be shouting back at us. So let's see where we get to.
I think everyone is like these two starting drams are great, but this is the main course that we might as well jump straight into whiskey number 3. So before we talk about whiskey number 3, how did Dramfool start? Like, did you guys were friends before? Like, where's the inception story?
Well, I started Dramfool in 2015, and I got the whiskey bug, or the bottling whiskey bug, when I used to work at a place, and colleagues of mine, we decided we liked whiskey. We would buy a cask, because at the time Bruichladdich Distillery were selling casks of whiskey. This was in 2005. They were selling, you could buy a bourbon barrel, as Joe blogs on the street, you could buy a bourbon barrel off them for £750. So it's obviously sounds quite cheap at, probably with inflation.
A full barrel.
Full barrel, yeah, just filled. So new make spirit, so you could order one. So I mean, in today's money, it's probably I don't know, $3,000 or $4,000. It's still, when you see what's happened to cask prices, it's still remarkably cheap. So me and 6 other guys all chipped in just over 100 quid each and bought this cask. And when it was 3 years old, we went to Isla to visit it, to take pictures of the cask as you do, and get samples out of it. And when we were over there, one of the distillery workers approached us and says, I've got some casks for sale if you're interested. So we were a bit naive. I should have just bitten his hand off at the time, but I wanted to taste the whiskey first. So he said, I'll post you some. So he posted us some samples. They arrived in the post. We had to all taste them. And there was one that we particularly liked. So we went back to him and said, we'd like to buy this cask off you. And he said, it's gone. All my casks have gone. You're too late. So that was a sharp learning curve for me in whiskey. You just need to, if you're offered something, you just need to take it blind. And if it's no good, then sell it on. So that's what we do. So what he'd offered us was Port Charlotte. And Port Charlotte hadn't properly been released, I don't think, at that stage. I don't know if PC5 had been out. Anyway, he then put us in touch with someone else who sold us a cask of 6.5-year-old sherry matured Port Charlotte. It was a hogshead, first full hogshead. And she was actually Jim McEwen's secretary. So she was secretary to the master blender at the distillery. We thought it was really heavily sherried. And when it turned 8 years old, we thought we should really bottle this. So I organized the bottling of it, labeling, etc., etc. We had this whiskey that basically had cost us £23 a bottle, and it was cask strength whiskey, and it was stunning. We took some over to Islay for the whiskey festival to let people taste it. The word got round about the island. These guys have got an outstanding, heavily sherried 8-year-old Port Charlotte from the first distillation, because it was 2001 was the first time they distilled it. And people were coming up and offering us, bearing in mind the bottle had cost us 23 all in, people were offering us 80 to 100 pounds a bottle. And technically we weren't allowed to sell because we don't have a license or premises license. Obviously there were a few backhanders here and there, and bottles disappearing out the boot of our car at other distilleries' open days. But it suddenly occurred to me, I really enjoyed this, and you could actually make a living out of doing this. I know there's a lot of other indie bottlers out there, but there are a lot of big independent bottlers who just bottle everything they get their hands on, and the quality isn't there. So I thought, if I ever have some spare money, I'll set up a business, and I'll only bottle whiskey that I think is really good. And that was my mantra. I only bottle whiskey that I like. So that started part-time as a hobby, side hustle in 2015. And it was only probably about five years ago, maybe, that Colin and I met through a mutual friend. And Colin basically said, look, I told them the story of Dramfool, and he said, look, if you're ever short of a bit of cash, if there's any cash coming up, give me a shout. So we did a deal where we did a profit share on some of the casks that I was buying. And then obviously, out of the blue, we got approached by someone who knew someone who was selling a whole bunch of Islay casks from the same distillery, passed on my number to this guy, didn't know who he was. And then the next day I got a phone call, and I'm standing, I was up in Shetland, Isles of Shetland, because that's where I work as a process engineer. And I got a phone call from a number I didn't recognize, and I answered the phone, and this guy says, "Is that Bruce?" I'm like, yes. He says, "This is Jim McEwen." And I'm thinking, I didn't have a whiskey head on, so I was thinking, who the hell's Jim McEwen? I don't know a Jim McEwen. And then the penny dropped. I says, the Jim McEwen of Brookladdie and Bowmore and Islay. And he went, yes. Who else did you think would be called Jim McEwen? And I says, okay. He says, I've got 40 casks of whiskey that I've gathered throughout my time at Brookladdie. Would you be interested in buying them? And I had to think for, probably about 0.2 of a second. So we agreed to buy them. He sent me a list of the cask, and I looked at them and I looked at the prices, and I just thought, I can't do this on my own. There's no way I can get the funds, because we're talking about a substantial sum of money here. So I approached Colin. I said, how do you fancy coming in on this? And we'll create a new range called, and we thought about it and thought we would call it a Jim McEwen Signature Collection. So at the time, it was right at the first sort of 4 or 5 months of COVID. And fortunately, the UK government were offering what they call bounce back loans to small businesses. So you could apply for tens of thousands of pounds against the value of your business, and you'd pay it back over 5 years with 0% interest, which is just phenomenal. I mean, it just wouldn't do it now, but they were panicking about what COVID was doing to UK businesses. So I took out a loan against my oil and gas engineering company, against Dramfool, and Colin took out bounce back loans against his companies. So we managed to scrape enough money together. I mean, basically everything. We went all out, right up to the hilt, basically. We got as money as from any source that we possibly could, remortgaging the house, this, that, and the next thing, because I knew this was a once in a lifetime chance. Colin, being from Speyside, didn't really know who Jim McEwan was at the time. And he was saying, who is this guy? And I was trying to explain to him, this guy, he's like Billy Walker, he's like Richard Patterson, he's David Stewart, he's right up there. He's one of the, it's like, as I've said to people who don't know about whiskey and they ask who Jim McEwan is, he's like the Pele or the Messi or the Ronaldo of whiskey. He's a superstar. And then that's what makes people understand who Jim McEwan is. So that's how we really, when we really jumped into bed, when we both basically put our life's finances on the line.
Security and safety on the line.
Yeah.
Well,
so
as far as investments go, I was just going to say, like, you've picked one of the most popular or up and coming popular Islay, like contingent of casks. The demand for everything from Bruichladdich and the rest of the range there is just going through the roof globally. So it's kind of on the verge of being the next Springbank possibly. So I think you guys have done very well there.
That's how we've worked together. But fortunately, because of obviously the McEwan sales, we Colin and I don't take a wage out of Dramfool because until, well, we're still doing it, but we're gonna have to stop now. Any money that we pull in from sales of bottles, we buy more casks. So in the early days of Dramfool, all I could do was buy a cask, bottle it, and once I got the money in from the bottling, that would allow me to buy another cask. So it was just basically rolling one cask after another. Then I had an extra one I was able to buy. So at one stage I had maybe about 12 casks. Now I think we've probably got about 135, 140 casks, but with no money to show for it. So we need to stop buying casks and doing more bottling. So that's the plan.
We keep getting offered casks, so we keep going, but there's every cask, that could be the exception. So, but more importantly, we can loiter on about ourselves for a bit longer after the draft. Yep. What do we think of whiskey? So it's 11 years old, first fill bourbon cask. The majority of I think all, Bruce can correct me, but I think all the Bruichladdich casks that were sold to private investors who bought, which this is one of, and the next one similarly, were first fill. I think I'm right, Bruce?
Yeah, I think they offered first fill for everything, yeah, and sherry as well.
So this one's the first fill bourbon. So classic. I was going to say classic Bruichladdich, but I should say classic laddie just to make a pun. But you're on your third dram. Come off mute and ask some questions. Give us some opinions or tell us what's up. One of the two.
I mean, for me, this is slightly different from a kind of a 10, 11, 12-year-old first fill bourbon matured Bruichladdich to I've tasted quite a lot in that range, as you would imagine. This one, I think, it has all those elements, but it's a little bit spicy as well, which I haven't really picked up in many sort of young, because 10, 11 is considered young for Bruichladdich. I haven't really picked that up in many sort of young bourbon matured Bruichladdich before.
Comment here from Michael, a bit of the Islay funk to it. That could be the spiciness, you never know. A bit of water would help. Well, don't be shy. There's no prizes for drinking cask strength whiskey, as Jim said to somebody in a tasting we were on once, and it's how you like it. we would always say, as I'm sure you know, try it cask strength, try it neat, and then you decide what your palate thinks would improve. Now, how much water it would improve. And the answer may be none. That's absolutely true. But, you know, small amounts. But spicy and unusual, straight up in the centre of the palate. I like that, Troy, or with Matthew. Yeah, spicy. It's a good one.
It's very important with whiskey. I mean, there's a lot of snobbery in whiskey. Say, oh, you must add 25% water, or you must do this, you must do that. No, you experiment and you find what you like, and then you drink it that way. There's no right or wrong way to drink whiskey.
With ice and Coca-Cola's on the verge of wrong.
But. Yeah, but it's that's why we bottle all the whiskey that is released under our label. We bottle it at cask strength, and the reason for that is it gives you the choice as a consumer what to do. If we water it down to 46%, like those Ukrainian whiskies, then it might not be strong enough for you. And I've tasted a lot of whiskies that have been watered down, and you're just thinking, God, I just wish they'd left that at cask strength, because I think it just would have given it a bit more, you know. And then other times I've tasted whiskies that have been watered down, and you still think, my God, that's still a powerful whiskey. I could add a little bit of water to it. So we feel that if we bottle everything at cask strength, it gives more people more choice how to drink their whiskey.
So we've got a couple of questions coming in. David's saying, what's the sweet smell at the start of the nose? I'm getting a little bit of melon. I'm not sure what you guys else at home are getting.
Jim McEwen would say, because I've got his tasting notes in front of me, that the aroma opens beautifully on a marine aroma that could only come from Islay. It's an irresistible, mature aroma with the sweetness of malted barley in total harmony with the mellowness of the oak. Drifts of coastal and moorland plants and flowers emerge, fresh and full of promise. Add a touch of lemon and honey, sea air, and toasted oak staves. So there's the poetic tasting note. But the sweetness often comes from the bourbon that's been in the cask before as well. But yeah.
So just in case anyone at home is not familiar with Bruichladdich, it's based on Islay. They were founded in 1881 or something from memory. It ran for a while. It was mothballed, got some new investments, restarted again, and they bottle under Bruichladdich, which is 0 to 3 ppm, same as sort of Bunnahabhain, sort of unpeated Islay. Then you've got Port Charlotte, which is about 40 ppm from memory. And then you've got Octomore as well. So, and yes, it is the home of the yellow submarine. So I'll pull up a photo in a second, and we'll chat about it. So they bottle unpeated, peated, and like for comparison, Coela and Ardbeg are like 30, 35 ppm. So Port Charlotte's quite up there, and then Octomore can be in the hundreds. Big peat bombs, but we love it here as well.
And the thing to say as well is the Bruichladdich we're talking about, the Jim McEwen era, the modern era, started in 2001 when it was bought over from being mothballed, it being closed for a number of years and sort of ill-treated or forgotten, perhaps, you know, holes in the roof and things. And when they started, they had a wonderful old distillery with a wonderful provenance, but they turned all that on its head and they did things that nobody had really done before. So you've got Loch Lomond and you've got Bunnahabhain and other places now that do more than one spirit style. Nobody at the time felt you could do more than one spirit style. It was, no, you're a peated whiskey or you're a unpeated whiskey. So they really went, as it says on they're progressive Hebridean distillers. I think aggressively progressive might have been the case in the early days. You know, the casks they were using, the wine casks, people hadn't done it before. And it was real innovation from a seriously knowledgeable team that came from a distilling background with Jim and Duncan McGilvery and other people, and then kind of wine background with Simon Coughlin and Mark Rainier, who were directors and, you know, instrumental really in its reopening. So it's a wonderful. But as a Speyside, I did not understand it at all when you that history.
Islay is a very special place, and a lot of people, if you've never been, please make the journey to peated whiskey heaven. Is there anyone here who's actually? All I know is the Yellow Submarine lives at the front of Bruichladdich. It's a real submarine, or was used for exploration, but I don't know anything else outside of that. Do we know that the rest of the story?
Yeah. Basically, the Royal Navy, I think it was like an unmanned kind of reconnaissance sub, and it actually washed up on a beach not too far away from Bruichladdich, and it basically lost the Royal Navy boat. It had become untethered from that boat, and it washed up. So someone on the island went to the Royal Navy and said, "Look, we've got this. Is this yours?" And they came back and they took it away. So they did a bottling just to kind of, as Bruichladdich do, they try and find it in those days, try and find any excuse. And they did a bottle called the Yellow Submarine, and it was a bit of a joke with the Royal Navy, etc. And what happened, they did another bottling just recently, but I think that submarine out there isn't the actual one that washed up. I think they acquired another Yellow Submarine from somewhere else just to kind of stick outside the front of the distillery to continue the story. But what was really funny, and life's full of coincidences, I used to play five-a-side football with a guy who ended up going to the Navy. This was years ago, like 25 years ago. And he contacted me out of the blue about a year after the Yellow Submarine bottle came out. And he said, "Bruce, remember me? It's Gregor, blah, blah, blah." He says, "I'm a Royal Navy officer, this, that, and the next thing." He says, "Believe it or not," he says, "I was in charge of that when it became untethered." I was like, "You're joking." So I says, "Listen," he says, "do you think there's any chance of me getting a bottle from a distillery?" So I actually sent an email to Bruichladdich Distillery saying, "Listen, you've made a lot of money on the back of this Yellow Submarine bottling. I actually know the officer, on that frigate that was responsible for losing the Yellow Submarine, because he got a lot of abuse for it, like a lot of banter from all the other guys on the boat. I mean, it wasn't the end of the world because it was recovered." And I never got a reply. I honestly thought they would have replied, but they never replied. So it's a small world. And then they released another Yellow Submarine bottling possibly about 3 years ago. And those bottles are now selling for crazy money at auction. I think there was one went for about 3 times what it was retailing for the other night. So that's the story of the Yellow Submarine. And it kind of ties in with, they did this thing called Weapons of Mass Destruction, because during the second kind of it was the Iraq War and ISIS and all that sort of stuff. They actually had webcams in their still house, and so you could watch Budgie, the head stillman, doing his thing, and someone at the Pentagon must have logged into this and looked at what they were doing, and basically they were investigated by the UK security forces because they were saying, "Look, they've got all the equipment there for making chemical weapons." So I think as soon as the UK side got involved, they said, "Look, excuse my language, look, fuck off. It's a Scotch whisky distillery." So, but they were formally approached. So Bruichladdich then did a bottling called the WMD bottle and Weapons of Mass Destruction. So they always kind of try and jump on any little story like that and use it to their advantage, and in a humorous way, which is great.
These fun bottlings were done at a time when everyone else was doing labels that looked like wedding invites with gold edges and calligraphy. You know, it was completely rock and roll and punk and all that.
I think a lot of the Australian humour of being larrikins like aligns with that style of Scottish humour. So, you can win consumers purely on just silly fun, bottlings. I saw on that it said "do not touch" in red, the same marker as the Yellow Submarine itself. So yeah, it's great they borrowed those components and brought it across.
Yeah.
What I would say is if people have got any of Dram, whatever we're on, forgot we're on now, 3, if you've got any left, keep it in their glass for a second and then move on to Dram 4, assuming you've got 2 glasses, and just compare the 2 side by side. These were pretty much sister casks, weren't they? Bruce, weren't quite twins.
Yeah, so it's basically, I think, distilled roughly in about the same month or maybe a couple months apart. So the spirit would have been identical for all intents and purposes. So you've got one spirit going into one section of that spirit going into the bourbon barrel, and the other one going into the Reef Salt, which is a French kind of fortified red dessert wine. So it's kind of a little bit like a Sauterne, but it's red, maybe not as intense and syrupy as a Sauterne or viscous. And it was a wine stem. I like to think I know a lot about wine because I used to drink a lot of it, and not anymore though. But I'd never heard of Reef Salt before, and it's quite it's a very kind of small area. It's not very well known outside of France. But I think with this whiskey, it really adds a lot of fruit flavors, a lot of red fruits. There's cherries in there, maybe even some fresh plums, etc. And this is the second Reef Salt that we've bottled. We did one maybe 6 months prior to that, and the one that was 6 months prior was even a little bit darker. They're both, as far as we know, first fill Reef Salt. They're called barriques, and that obviously French for barrel, but they're not technically barrels, because in Scotland a barrel is 190 to 200 litres, a hogshead's 250. These wine barriques average in size about 225, so they're sort of halfway in between a barrel and a hogshead. But according to the guy I was talking about earlier on, who deals with a lot of casks, he was saying that the barriques are really hard to re-gauge, because how they re-gauge a cask is it's tipped up, so it's lying on its side, and they put basically like a measuring tape or a ruler through to the bottom of the cask, and they measure the wet, how deep the water, how deep the whiskey is. And they've got a chart with cask sizes, and they read it off that chart, and that determines how much liquid is in the cask before they bottle it. The other way you can do it is weigh the cask full and then weigh the cask empty and then put the liquid back in the cask. But that's just crazy. But that happened to one of ours, actually. So with the barrique, he says it's very hard to re-gauge them because they're not all 225. Some of them are 210, some of them are 240. So it's a bit unusual. And the other thing is really weird about these French wine casks is on the rim of the cask, so where the head of the cask is, they often have chestnut. In fact, if you bear with me a second, here's one I prepared earlier, as they used to say on Blue Peter's TV children's program.
Going for a walk.
UK.
This is the sunshine of Linlithgow. You're 25 minutes.
Well, it's not raining, but it's not sunny. So
it's gone a bit dull here all of a sudden.
Can you see that? There's
Perfect.
wood round the rim of that cask. Well, that's actually chestnut from chestnut trees. And basically the reason they put that on, I only found this out a few years ago, is that in certain regions of France, there's a beetle that likes eating oak, which is bad if you've got a lot of wine casks in a warehouse in France. So what they do is they put that chestnut round the rim, and the beetles prefer the chestnut. So they eat the chestnut and leave the oak alone. Very clever.
Before technology, you can only solve problems with what you had, so that's cool.
Yeah, it's like they do the same with metals. It's like it's like sacrificial protection. So the chestnut gets eaten, and the oak containing the wine is left alone. So yeah, very clever.
So we've just tried these sister casks. Obviously the bourbon first. Now this French red wine, which I'm not going to attempt to pronounce again. what's the feedback in the room? Yay, nay, midway? What are people liking? Do they have a preference towards the bourbon or the red? Which way are people kind of leaning? Michael says the first release was an insane color. Both of them are very tasty and aren't lasting long. A couple of drops of water opens up beautifully. Gilly says,
Salt's getting a thumbs up here. We're getting, Reef Salt, the best thumbs up from David T. So, which I think the amazing thing is, same spirit from the same still. Let's just assume on the same day, roughly the same day, bottled roughly the same day, so the same age, and you couldn't confuse those two whiskies. And that's already what I think is interesting with these things. It's how that there's such variety. I like that Gilly's onto the second bottle already. So there's obviously one of Michael's customers there. I'm glad to hear.
There's a few people always support us and Michael in general. So thank you. I'm getting a bit of like sugared white powder that you get like on a Christmas cake on the finish of this red wine. Like it's the dryness, but it's like white powdered sugar.
I think that let's see what Jim says, because again, I could pretend these are my tasting notes, but anyone would have a clue they're not. So it's, what was it? Add a drop of water, the sweetness of the malted barley in harmony with the oak evolve, bringing the island character and personality to remind you the spirit's DNA. A true islander distilled by a team of dedicated men to whom distilling is in their DNA. No computers, no E150, no color added, no chill filtration, and no bullshit. It's a warm, generous spirit that truly reflects the personality of the island. The bouquet is generous, opening on red fruits, cherries, plump red grapes, encapsulated in a halo of French oak, which blends beautifully with the sweetness of the barley. The Isla character and Hebridean overture matured on the edge of the Atlantic Ocean. There we go. So it's exactly what Bruce and I would have said had we written tasting notes, but just a few more words in there. But
look, if you can write your own, but if you got Jim, offering to write them, you might as well, right?
Look, hey, we could talk a lot of nonsense as you're all learning, but we can't write tasting notes like that. So no, I mean, this is the thing that we knew we were really lucky when we bought Jim's cask. It was the right place, right time, and then took a big gamble. But what we thought was that we'd buy the casks, get a handshake, thank you very much, enjoy it, boys, and away you go. And we couldn't have been further from wrong. Sorry, he's bought into what we do, how we do things. He's really keen to support what we do, and the whiskies of his that we bought, and ones like this that he distilled that didn't belong to him personally, they're like his children. He puts so much into the making of these that he takes it so personally. So we're so lucky that he does that. And he's on the phone every week. He was on the phone yesterday, actually. So we've got plans afoot for other things, which is great. And that quality of the team they had, and he always talks about the team, and we're very keen to make the point we understand that as well. The team at Brookladdy, it was not just a one-man show, were second to none, and created these fantastic whiskies. So it's absolutely super, and it's great to share them. And Jim, as much as anything, wants whiskey to be enjoyed. I can see a few fantastic whiskey cabinets on the screen here, and there's a few odd bottles behind me too. And that's great. But I think when you enjoy them, when you collect them, when you open them with friends, I have a bottle sitting in the cupboard that when 3 friends and I get together in a couple of weeks, that's the one that gets opened. That's been sitting there gathered in dust for 2 years, and I think it's a wonderful thing to be able to do this, and for our perspective to do this. Well, we're in Queensland, Troy and Matty, and I don't know where everyone else is in the country there, but you're not in Edinburgh, let's put it that way. So it's fantastic fun. So it's great.
On that note, just because it's conscious of time, we've already taken an hour of your time. You got a little bit more available for us?
Well, we've got Dram 5 and 6 here. So
yeah, so I just wanted to clarify, there's been a slight label mix-up. I said at the beginning, but just in case people missed out. So you should tell by color that whiskey number 5, which is like pitch black, that is actually meant to be whiskey number 6. That's the Oloroso. And whiskey number 6, which is meant to be the bourbon, is actually whiskey number 5. So my apologies, our label person just stuck the wrong labels on. So light whiskey is the bourbon, which we're on to next. And then the darker one of the two is the Oloroso finish. So just rotate your glass samples around.
What I would say is if you're sitting there with 2 glasses, pour these both at the same time, because this is something that you don't get to do very often. These are both Port Charlotte, so from Bruichladdich Distillery, but the heavily peated, so the 40 ppm, as Oliver was explaining before. They're both distilled on exactly the same day. So the spirit came off the stills on the same day. They were filled into the casks on the same day. The light colored one, the bourbon, first fill bourbon, and the darker one, obviously first fill Oloroso sherry hogshead. And they were matured on Islay for their whole lives. We took them off about 3 weeks before we bottled them. So let's just say the full Islay maturation. And then they were bottled on the same day. So these whiskies have had exactly the same life, which is fantastic. They were both bought by a private husband and wife bought them. They had two sons. They bought one for son A and one for son B. I think the money's gone into the exorbitant amount of money we gave them, which we were delighted to do, has gone into the university fund, along with a few bottles to enjoy. So these are true sisters. You know, you hear about, we've used the word sister casks for the Bruichladdich 11s. These are as close a spirit as you can get. So I want everyone off mute for this one, just to warn you as well, because I don't have to talk so much. Tell me what you think. Some people think Port Charlotte really works with bourbon more than it does with sherry. As I hinted at before, I think when you've got a sherry, sweetness from a sherry, and that that deep, rich, dried fruits, Christmas cake, all the kind of classic Glenfarclas, Glenallachie tasting kind of notes. And you pair that with a smoke, it's a bit like, smoked, maple smoked bacon or something. We know that works, that kind of sweetness and smoke. I think it works fantastically.
Colin, it's good. I haven't even tasted it.
That's what I want to hear.
It is smelling great.
Fantastic. No, I'm glad. It's an unusual whiskey. It was distilled in 2004. Port Charlotte was only distilled, I think I'm right, Bruce, I think said 2001, 2. But so it's an early one. This is when they're getting right. And Port Charlotte sometimes has they call it like a dirty tasting note to it, like a kind of farmyardy funk. We used the Isle of Funk term in the chat earlier. A kind of farmyardy, heavy, dirty smoke to it.
Stinky goodness.
Yeah, exactly. So Matt knows what I'm talking about. So try the two side by side. I'll stop whittering on for a minute and then give us some thoughts. There's no wrong answers here. Just, Billy David who said they were good, but there are no wrong answers.
So Michael's been very kind to me and got me into as many casks as a few unopened behind me. Every single Dramfool I've had in since 40s up to now, you guys are bottled it at cask strength, and these are single casks, but they drink so well, like from neck pour. Yes, add a little bit of water if you want to, but like as they are, and as consistently, like bottle after bottle. Yes, some are more fun than others. Some I like the 58 that we just had, the red one, red wine from France. That to me, I'd take to a tasting with a bunch of mates who really like laddie and go, here's something funky, something different to try and get that feedback. The bourbon I would keep for myself because I love it so much. But each one of these just drinks so well, straight a natural cask strength, which is I think a phenomenal achievement. So well done on your cask selection.
Well, I mean, we're very lucky. We always say that we don't make the whiskey. We don't buy the casks in the first instance to fill. We are at the kind of the want of the distiller, and so it shows the quality of what Bruichladdich were doing and the team they had there. We've been very cautious of what we buy. Well, not cautious of what we buy, so cautious of what we bottle once we buy it. And Bruce's mantra of only bottling whiskey that he likes, as he explained earlier, is absolutely key. If these had been bad whiskies, or the sherry, for example, if the sherry had been really sulfury, we wouldn't have bottled it. We'd have had to sell it on. We've done that with various casks in the past, and it's always casks you really want to bottle, like ones you're kind of distilleries you don't see so often, or ones that you think, God, I love that whiskey. I'd love to do our own one. So we're really conscious about that because you've said some lovely things about the whiskey there, and we want that to continue. And we're only 2 bad bottlings away from losing anybody as a client. If you get one you don't like, you go, oh, that's just not me. That's okay. I'll share that with friends I don't like so much. The second one in a row you don't like from us, you're like, they've lost their touch a bit. I wonder what this bottler's doing. So we've got to really bear that in mind. And we're standing here, we're the ones, or Bruce particularly, we're the ones that chose to put it in the bottle. So if we're standing at a festival on Islay, or we were in Holland last week, or we were talking to you guys in Australia here, we have to do this with confidence. This isn't a kind of, this is, you know, you can see through all the bullshit in this world. We shouldn't be the ones peddling it. So I'm enjoying the chats and the chat bar here. This was clearly a keeper. I'm with you on that one, Troy. Yeah, convert any non-believer. Amazing to have them side by side. I think that's the fun of them side by side. That's why I suggest you do that. Go to check if Michael has any left. I know Michael was holding some bottles back from all of these ones, I believe. So I think he probably does have some in store, but yeah, get there quick, because yeah,
you guys are doing my job. We have a little bit. I've been so busy with so many things, so I haven't put my stock up online, but send me an email, something you're interested in. Otherwise, jump onto Michael's site, the Rare Liquor King. They're based in Melbourne, Victoria there. Michael and the team, yeah, they know whiskey, and they obviously know Dramfool, so support Michael. The more you guys buy from Michael means the more Dramfool are going to come into Australia, so it's a win-win for everyone. So I've just posted the link in there.
No,
Is
do you know the story of Port Charlotte?
Well, which one? Because as far as I know, I believe it was a separate setup meant to be or something, and then they brought it back in.
Well, what happened was when they restarted the distillery in 2001. It's a funny thing in the UK. You know, in the States, if you've got a superstar, a Michael Jordan, Tiger Woods, or whatever, you know, they champion these guys. They heap praise on them. They like seeing them do well. And in the UK, there's a lot of people. If we've got someone who's doing particularly well, a lot of people don't like seeing people doing well for some reason. So obviously, Jim McEwen and his team did well getting Bruichladdich up and running, but there was a lot of back chat from certain people on the island saying, it's not a proper Islay whiskey. It's not peated. You know, it's not a Lafroig. It's not an Ardbeg, a Lagavulin. So Jim McEwen thought, right, I'll show these guys. I'll make something more heavily peated than any of the other distilleries at the time. Ardbeg have subsequently upped their peating rate. I think it's up at about 55 now, but that's probably because what they did at Bruichladdich, because most of I think Lagavulin, Lafroig, Ardbeg were all about 35 at the time. So Jim went to a maltster on the mainland because he couldn't approach the maltster on Islay because they were producing malt. They were owned by Diageo, and they were producing the malt for Lagavulin and Kalila, and he didn't want to work with them. So he went to a maltster on the mainland and said, you know, can you produce a malted barley at 40 ppm phenols so that we can produce the most heavily peated whiskey? They went, yeah, we'll do that for you. So after they'd done their little production run at the maltster, they came back to Jim McEwen and says, well, we've actually had a bit of a problem. This barley, we've peated it to 80 parts per million. And Jim was going, that's too strong. That'll just be crazy. And they said, well, what you can do is you could mix the barley 50-50 with unpeated malted barley. So, you know, you get 50% of the 80 ppm and 50% of the 0 ppm. You mix it together and you've got barley at 40 ppm. So he says, yeah, that'll work. So they produced Port Charlotte. And that's how they produced Port Charlotte. So it has a different, it's made using the same stills, but they have a different cut. They tend to pick up more of the kind of heavier oils and components than the Bruichladdich. Bruichladdich got a finer, delicate cut. And then one day, Jim McEwen had a brainwave. He thought, yeah, this is pretty good, but let's go one step further. Let's just use the 80 ppm phenoled barley. And that's what they did. So that's how Octomore was born. So the reason they called it Octomore is because up behind Bruichladdich, there used to be a distillery called Octomore. This was I think it shut down in the 20s, there was a distillery in Port Charlotte, which is 2 miles away from Bruichladdich, and that was called Port Charlotte. And interestingly, there's a farm where the old Octomore distillery used to sit called Octomore Farm, and that's the source water. There's a spring there, and that's where they get their source water for Bruichladdich. So he liked the name Octomore, plus it was 80 parts per million, octo for 8. So that's when Octomore was born. So the first Octomore that was produced was made using barley peated to 80 ppm. And then subsequent to that, as we all know, tried to push the boundary. And I think the highest peating level they ever used in Octomore was upwards of 300 parts per million phenols. So that's the story of Octomore and Port Charlotte. And they also produced an even rarer spirit called Loch-and-Dol. And Loch-and-Dol was peated to 50 parts per million, so it's more heavily peated than Port Charlotte, but they use a really fine cut on the distillation, so it's a really elegant peated spirit. And those are the 4 styles, or the 4 spirits that Bruichladdich have produced. Now, Michael's just put a post in the chat saying Loch-and-Dol and Rins. Rins, until very recently, I believe, was the 5th spirit type that they produced at Bruichladdich. But an insider at Bruichladdich told Colin and myself last year that Rins isn't actually a distilled spirit in its own right. Rins is actually a mixture of Port Charlotte and Bruichladdich. So there you go. So Rins is peated to 30 ppm. So they've used 40 ppm Port Charlotte with the approximately 4 ppm Bruichladdich and mixed it together to produce Rins. So Rins technically isn't a single malt. It's a blended malt.
It's a single
but
malt.
some people say, I mean, this is the argument. Bruichladdich produced a blended malt whiskey last year called the Ternary Project, and it was a mixture of Bruichladdich, Port Charlotte, and Octomore. And people like me, you know, would say that you could argue it's a single malt because it's produced from the same distillery. And okay, it's 3 different spirit types, but it's produced at the same distillery. So some people would argue that it's a single malt, but then other people would argue, and I'm kind of getting to that point myself, that the spirit cuts, i.e. the way it's distilled, the Octomore, the Port Charlotte, and the Bruichladdich, yeah, it's all distilled at the same distillery, but they've got different distillation cuts. So technically these are 3 individual single malts in their own right. So if you mix them together, it's a blended malt. So it's kind of, no one's really given me a definitive answer on whether if you mix distillates distilled in different conditions at the same distillery, if it's still classed as a single malt or it's a blended malt. It's kind of open to discussion.
I'm sure we'll get the answer in a couple of years. I'm going to put up a poll. Vote for your top 1 and 2 whiskies of the night, like we always do. Whilst the poll is running, I've got a couple of questions. Anyone else, if you've got questions, put it into the chat and we'll ask the guys if they can spare a few more minutes. My first question is the labels. So if you look at your various Dramfool labels, and hopefully it's not too glary with my screen, you've got these barrels stacked up. Some are red colored, some have flags on it. What do these different labels mean? Yeah, well, the one with the flag on it, that was a one-off bottling we did for our brand ambassadors. So we've got brand ambassadors. At the time, they were in the States, Germany, and Singapore, and we wanted to do. They'd been asking, "Can you do a single cask for us that's unique to us, and we'll sell the bottles for you?" So we went, "Yeah, fine, we can do that." So we got them a Loch-and-Dol, which, as I've said, is extremely rare. Loch-and-Dol, they only ever filled 500 casks over 2 different distillations that were carried out in 2007, 2009. Now, you might notice there's Loch-and-Dols that are sold as 2010 Loch-and-Dol.
which strictly is true. The spirit was distilled in 2009, and it was stored in big plastic 1,000-litre IBCs, industrial bulk spirit containers, which is like a big plastic cube, food grade plastic. And basically what they did with the Loch-and-Dol, as people bought the casks of Loch-and-Dol that they were offering to the general public, they would fill from these containers. So technically it doesn't start aging until it hits the wood. So any 2010 Loch-and-Dol that you see out there was distilled in 2009, but wasn't actually put into cask until 2010. So we offered them, sorry, I've digressed again. They've offered, we offered them that cask, and what happened was, they said, oh, we'll take all this. And I said, well, you're not going to get anything rarer than a Loch-and-Dol. It's actually rarer than Port Ellen. That's the way to look at it. It's rarer than Port Ellen because there were only ever 500 cask fill. And disappointingly, they never took the full allocation, which is great for you guys because Michael got some of
Michael got a big chunk, yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
I
don't know if I can speak on behalf of Michael, but Michael, Australia will gladly take an entire cask of Loch-and-Dol or anything else you can throw our way. So please remember us down here.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's why those flags were on the label. The different coloured casks, we kind of stick to the routine that if it's yellow, it's bourbon. If it's amber, sort of orange colour, it's a single grain. If it's red, it's sherry. If it's kind of a darker, deeper red, it's port. If it's purple, it's rum. And then the one anomaly to that was the Loch-and-Dol, because we decided it was so rare that we would just use the Bruichladdich Blue for Loch-and-Dol. And then the position of these coloured in casks on that stack of barrels, people say, well, what, how come some of them are at the top and some of them are on the left and the right and the bottom? What's the reasoning behind that? And it's random. It's just random. There's no rhyme or reason to it.
Bruce decides on the morning where to go.
Yeah. So yeah, that's it. But with some of them, you'll see that with some of the casks that we've done recently that were distilled at Bruichladdich, whether it's Port Charlotte, Bruichladdich, Loch-and-Dol, Octomore, the top barrel has a little kind of map of Islay, and if you look closely at it, it says McEwen Legacy. And what Jim has agreed with us, that any casks of whiskey that we buy that were distilled when he was there as the master blender and manager, even though they're not his casks, but they were distilled under his kind of supervision, if we send him a sample of it and he likes it, we can call that the McEwen Legacy. So we're the only independent bottler out there who have got that permission to use his name on casks of whiskey that weren't owned by him, but they were distilled when he was at Bruichladdich. So it's a bit of a feather in the cap for us. Adds on another 50 quid to the bottle as well, which is good. Only joking.
There's a question in the chat, Bruce, that are we thinking of doing any other labelings or any other styles? So probably I
can show you. We've just, what we've been thinking of doing is because we are like Bruichladdich in the early days. Bruichladdich in the early days, they started releasing a few bottlings from 2001 onwards, and people started collecting those bottles. And then it got to the stage after a few years that every time the wind changed direction, a new release would come from Bruichladdich, and people just couldn't keep up with the bottles. So we're like that. We've increased the number of bottles we're releasing, because obviously Colin and I want to make this a full-time job so we can give up our day jobs. But if we do that with the same label, we're going to alienate the guys who have collected every single bottle. And I mean, I've got guys that have got all 61 releases that we've done, plus all the McEwen stuff as well. So we thought we're going to have to bring out another range so that they don't feel obliged to collect that, but it allows us to release more whiskey and bring in a bit more money so that Colin and I can move full time. So we just got these bottles the other day, and if you can see that, it's called Dramfool's Middle Cut. So as you can see, we've got a nice cut in the middle of the label, middle cut being the best cut of the whiskey. This is a 14-year-old Kalila. It's in a different shade bottle. This one we bottled for K&L Wines, which is our importer in California. So we did 2 full casks for them. So they've taken 2 full casks from us. So this is the first Dramfool's Middle Cut. We're aiming to bottle whiskey that normally will be under £100 a bottle. But as we've already said, we're not going to put it in the bottle with our name on it unless it's good. It's not that we're bottling an inferior whiskey. It's that we now have a supplier who can supply us casks from certain distilleries at kind of trade price rather than the inflated prices that we're paying in the open market with brokers. So it means, we can do these Kalilas, at a decent price. And these are going to be the bottles that basically go direct to trade. So they'll already have there's a margin in there so the retailers can make a bit on it, whereas the standard Dramfool bottles and the McEwen, we don't have that margin built in, because most of our customers, with a few exceptions like Michael, are, we sell direct to people. We're hoping that 90% of these bottles will go straight to trade. So they'll go to Michael, they'll hopefully go to people like Master and Malt. We've got an importer in Germany and Belgium who will take a big chunk of it, and we will be selling this on our website for the same price as everyone else. So you don't have the problem that, you could just come direct to us and get it cheaper. Obviously, it's slightly different for you guys because it's horrendously expensive for us to ship a single bottle to you. So you're better buying from Michael because he is getting a slight discount. But that's because we like them. Hopefully you guys do too. So yeah, this is the new range Dramfool's Middle Cut. We also,
when's that coming to Australia? I don't know if Michael's got any on the way.
We as I said, all of that, there's 2 casks of Kalila, all of it went to the States, went to California, but we've got a wine, 100% wine matured Taninic, and we know for a fact because the guy that supplied us these casks used to work with Diageo, and it's the first time Diageo have ever filled Taninic into red wine barriques, and it was an experiment, and they haven't done anything with the casks, and he knew about them, and he approached them and said, can I have some of them? So we bought 6 of these casks. So that possibly will be one of the first Dramfool middle cuts that will be going to the likes of Michael. We've obviously got some more of this Kalila as well, which is great. These were actually, we re-racked this Kalila into Jim McEwen casks. So the Jim McEwen casks that we emptied for Dramfool's Jim McEwen range, we put the Kalila into that, and it had been maturing in there for 6 months. So for instance, this one was in one of Jim's bourbon barrels. The other one was in First Fill Chateau Latour cask. It hasn't really picked up any colour for the reasons I explained earlier on, but it's picked up a little bit of the wine, the kind of wine influence on the palate. There'll also be, I'm trying to think, I think the first one we're going to release, we're thinking of doing it. We work in tandem with a company called Bevy, Bevvy, who have an app that you can put on your phone, and you can basically scan a label of a bottle and it'll bring up all the information about that whiskey. It'll tell you all about the distillery. It'll tell you all about that particular bottle with tasting notes if they have them uploaded, and it will give you information where you can buy that bottle if it's no longer available to purchase at retailers. It'll give you recent auction prices and if there are any bottles currently in auction. So we've been working with them. So we're thinking of releasing possibly a Bruichladdich Syrah cask as our first middle cut. which will kind of sit outside the £100 a bottle range that we were talking about. I'll show you why.
This sounds very exciting.
So this is the Syrah Bruichladdich. So as you can see, it's quite dark, and it's absolutely outstanding. So we're thinking of launching that as a first release. The other thing we're doing is we recently bought the most expensive cask by a long way that we've ever purchased. It was a 1992 Bourbon hogshead of Bruichladdich. We were hoping to bottle it as a 30-year-old this year, but it actually turns 31 in March, and by the time we get the cask off the island to our bottler, it will be 31. So it's going to be a 31-year-old Bruichladdich. Obviously, it's not going to be a cheap bottle. I'll be open and honest with you. This cask cost us £75,000. Okay, so we're not making a huge profit margin on it. We just wanted to bottle it as a feather in our cap. So we think it'll retail for about 575, maybe 600 a bottle, which is, I know, is expensive, but if you look at 31-year-old Bruichladdich out there, most of them are more expensive than that. There was one release recently which was about 495, but they obviously got their casks from a cheaper source than us. So that, again, because it's a bit expensive, we thought we can't just bottle it in a standard tall round Dramfool bottle. So my brainwave, and I've almost got Colin round to this. We're going to call our kind of uber premium bottles. They're going to be known as Dramfool's Gold.
I like it. Your price is actually, like, at least on the Australian market, quite fair. So comparing it to a lot of 1990s, 91, 92 Islers, secret Islers, but they're all Lafroigs or Ardbegs or occasionally the Lagavulins, they're about that £600, which is about 1,100, 1,200 Australian dollars here, landed, once we've factored in our tax and excise and all the other fun things we do here. So that price, I think, is right on the money. I would definitely pay that for a 31-year-old.
Yeah,
We'll be
and the thing was, right,
some of them to Michael. So do let Michael.
This shows us how crazy we are. We bought that cask blind. Hadn't tasted it. We knew, the guy said, once you buy it, I'll send you a sample. Like, so obviously £75,000 is a horrendous amount of money to pay for a cask of whiskey. But interestingly, we'd had a conversation, without name dropping, but we spoke to Simon Coughlin, who's the last remaining director of Bruichladdich from the takeover in 2001, and we were actually looking for an old cask of whiskey for a client of ours. And I said, have you got anything older than 30 years old in your warehouse? Obviously, this guy's willing to pay a premium for it, and would like to bottle it in conjunction with yourselves. And the guy wants to send people across to visit a distillery, and it'll be good for the distillery. And he says, sounds great, but he says, we've hardly got any stock older than 30-year-old, and we want to keep it for ourselves. He says, we've got a handful of casks. And then the following month, I get an email from a broker saying, we've got 4 casks of 1992 Bruichladdich here. Are you interested? So after that conversation, I thought, right, okay, there's casks sitting there that are that age, but they're not owned by Bruichladdich. They're owned by various individuals. So we did try to push the boat out to buy 2, but we just couldn't afford it. They were all roughly the same price. So we bought 1. And then 3 weeks after we got the paperwork through, this sample arrived with the whiskey in it, and I was, I'll be honest, I was absolutely shitting myself, because I thought, if I nose this and it's horrible, I'm going to be suicidal, because we're going to be stuck with a 75 grand cask that we're going to have to try and move on to somewhere else. And it's a lot easier to move on a cask that's worth 10 grand than it is a cask that's worth 75, because you're really closing down the number of people who can afford to buy that. So it's unbelievably good. Honestly, it made me extremely happy. It made my day, my week, my month. It's like a tropical storm in a glass. It's absolutely fantastic whiskey. Very, very fruity, lots of tropical fruits. So we, as we would say in Scotland, we won a watch with that one. It was
Yeah.
So yeah, lots ahead is the good thing. We've got, as Bruce has said, this technically is a part-time job. It doesn't feel like it when we're humping boxes and packing bottles, but with all these things now just coming together, it hopefully gives us that ability to make it a full-time job and keep the pace up, do some interesting things, and yeah, put some good whiskey in bottles and get it to the four corners of the world. Is the plan. So yeah.
I'm going to share the results of the poll now. Michael's just put up his details, so the Rare Liquor King at outlook.com. Hit him up. He'll look after you. Maybe we can get an Australian cast. Michael, I'll chat to you afterwards. We at the Whiskey List, we're definitely keen for some more laddie here. Without further ado, here are the results. So, this is multiple choice. I said top 1 and 2 whiskies of the night. Unfortunately, no love for the Tullibardine. Always hardest going the first whiskey of the night. But yeah, we had some love for the Glenrothes. And the red wine cask did well. And where else? What are the results here? Yeah, I think the winner is the Oloroso at the end, the 18-year-old. Just two votes ahead of the bourbon cask, basically. But yeah, well done to that Oloroso. It's a lingering finish. Definitely, it's a wonderful dram to finish on.
I'm glad it seemed to be enjoyed. That's pretty even scores there. It's good.
Any final questions, comments, feedback to the team? I know we've gone a little bit over time the tasting, but there's so much wealth of knowledge to be shared tonight. So we've really enjoyed your time, guys. Both thank you, Bruce and Colin. We'll give it one more minute for any last questions. Otherwise, might call it a night.
We've got work to do. It's early in the morning.
All right, I think that's it in terms of questions. If you guys and Michael yourself just stay on for a couple of minutes, just have a very quick debrief. Otherwise, thank you everyone for joining tonight. We will see you at the next virtual tasting. Hit up Michael. If you want any of the Dramfools, he will look after you, and yeah, we'll do our best to try and get an Australian exclusive because I really want one, but I'm sure everyone else here is keen too. So cheers again, guys. Thank you.
Thanks for having us. Really enjoyed your company. Thank you.
Thanks, guys. Appreciate it.
Hit pause on the recording.